This podcast is supported by VIPLA, the Victorian Planning Environmental Law Association. Welcome to the Planning Exchange, where we interview built environment professionals doing interesting work beyond the ordinary. Welcome to a very special episode of the podcast today, one that marks several exciting firsts. Today I'm stepping into new territory by hosting without the legendary Peter Jewell. It's also the first time I'm joined by the brilliant Cam Alderson, who I'll introduce shortly. And perhaps most exciting of all, this is our debut video episode and our first release on YouTube. For those that haven't met Cameron Alderson, Cam brings over 3 decades of hands-on experience in property development and investment to Future School, a voluntary think tank exploring how technological and economic shifts are reshaping our cities and communities. Now semi-retired, Cam dedicates his time to connecting visionary thinkers and sparking conversations about the future. Through Future School's collaborations, including with Planning Exchange, he helps planners, community leaders and investors navigate change and build resilient, thriving places. And today we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Cern Basher, President and Chief Investment Officer at Brilliant Advice. Cern is a financial advisor and an autonomous car enthusiast. And so why are we talking to a financial advisor, you might ask? Well, it's a very good question, and one that I'll let Cam Alderson speak to.
Thank you, Jess. Pleasure to be on the Planning Exchange with Cern in particular. Cern, I was presenting at a conference not too long ago on a panel about the advent of the autonomous vehicle. It was a room full of very senior planners, lawyers, traffic engineers from Victoria. Probably about 500 of them. And I did a poll, I did a little straw poll. I said, put your hand up if you think that the autonomous vehicle will be safer than a human driver in 2050. I got about half the audience. And then I said, leave your hand up if you think that'll be sooner, 2040, dropped down to about a third. And leave your hand up if you think it's 2030. And I was about 5% of the audience. And I finished, ironically, that was the day that Tesla, a full self-driving supervised, went live in Australia. And I said, I think we're all asleep at the wheel, pardon the pun. It's actually safer today. So it's a worry because these are the decision makers planning long-term city futures. And it just prompted me to think, who can we talk to who can give us some, reality check on how soon this disruptive technology is going to start impacting cities all over the world, in particular, in our case, Melbourne, but we've got an audience all over the world. And I just sort of surmise that it's possible that all planning brains around the world are possibly just thinking, I've heard it all before, it was going to be ready back then, and maybe it's never going to happen. And perhaps they're all thinking the same way, and we'll all mis-optimising the opportunity, because it will be dramatic, I think, in terms of how cities should plan. So hence we have reached out to you as a financial analyst who, as I understand, has built detailed financial models for autonomous vehicle industry widely. And I suppose in the first question, if that's the context, now, are we looking at a genuine transformation of how cities work, or is this just another technology that might take longer to reach mass adoption than initially promised?
Yes. Well, thank you, Cam and Jess, for having me on this podcast. I think this is a really important topic that we all need to think about and encourage others to think about. But to your question, this is a technology that's going to completely change the way cities operate, look, sound, and we'll get into those details in a minute. And it's coming, I think, sooner than most realize. Now, like any disruptive technology, you may have heard about it a long time ago, and then it hasn't happened, and then it hasn't happened, and hasn't happened. The problem is the rate of change is not linear. The rate of change is an exponential. So in exponential curves, it's an S curve, and on the S curves, it's a slow ramp, and then it goes vertical. Right? Whereas if it was linear, it would just be the stair step every year. And I think that's the problem. It lulls us into a sense of, this is not going to happen. When in reality, you will wake up one day and all of a sudden, there it is. And we're seeing that now in the United States with the rollout of Tesla's Robotaxi service and the new version now of Tesla's full self-driving, which I'm so glad that you folks in Australia now have an opportunity to experience that. the supervised version, but it is coming fast, and I think we're going in the next 2-3 years, it's going to be a worldwide phenomenon.
I think you're right. I think from a tech perspective, as you say, this has been coming for such a long time. There's been discussions about this, and we've had discussions on this podcast, I think, since we started this podcast, which was about 2014. We were having a lot of conversations with people. And then it seemed like there were probably 5-6 years in there where there's been absolutely no discussion about it in our industry. And I'm not saying that hasn't happened outside of it, but certainly within our industry, I feel like there's been nothing said about it. There's been a little bit of talk about drone delivery and the use of drones and how we might enter that market from a town planning perspective, but not a lot about driverless cars. So I think it's a really interesting one, and one that I really look forward to talking more about through this podcast. So Cern, in terms of the concept of autonomous vehicles, I think we can all agree that there's a huge advantage taking or using that technology in our cities and how we build our cities. Do you think that autonomous vehicles will make cities better places? And if so, why? And what's the promise here for people who live and work in cities?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Let me ask you, what do you dislike about cities today? Right. And I think some of the answers would be, well, it's noisy, pollution, congestion, right? Some of those things I think would be at the top of the list. Right. And so autonomous vehicles are the combination of electric vehicles, which are they don't pollute, they're very quiet. And then the autonomous feature, over time, as more and more of the vehicles become autonomous, the congestion problem should just fade away, because eventually the vehicles will just all communicate with themselves. You won't even need traffic lights at some point, right? That's the ultimate promise, where these vehicles just feather themselves through intersections. Now, as long as there's human drivers on the road, that can't happen, obviously, but at some point. So it has the promise, I think, of making cities so much more livable, so much more enjoyable. Now, there's two components to this, because if a city is more livable and more enjoyable, then being downtown, living in a central core, may be more appealing. At the same time, if you're able to be in a vehicle and not be attentive and have to drive it, if you could just sleep at the wheel, so to speak, in fact, these vehicles won't have any wheels, but just sleep in the vehicle, then living outside the city and commuting in every day for an hour would be no big deal, because you could do other things, whether it's sleep, read, work, play video games, etc. So it's going to totally change the way that humans spend their time and think about where they want to live. And I think it has the promise of making cities really quite special. I think this is an opportunity for cities to really set themselves apart and create beautiful living spaces for their citizens.
And sorry, we're probably going back to basics here in this introduction to this podcast, but I think it's important to, dispel some of the myths in this space as well. And I know that some of the people that we've interviewed over the years around this topic more generally have spoken to the challenge and perhaps the insurmountable challenge that you have in terms of that interim period where you have some driverless cars, you have some standard cars, for better term, and how do the two interrelate? Can you have a system where you have both driverless and standard cars?
Well, it's not ideal, is it? It's a bit like having a transportation system that's all horses and then introducing vehicles. I'm sure that was a messy transition in many ways. The horses create their own messes, and then the vehicles themselves probably weren't very safe, and drivers didn't know how to drive back then. So I think we're going to have some similar challenges now in having autonomous vehicles operate within the construct of human-driven vehicles. Now, the good news is that the autonomous vehicles are just going to behave like the most polite driver you've ever seen. So the humans can continue to be crazy behind the wheel, and the autonomous vehicles will not care. So the more autonomous vehicles we have on the road, the less, incidents and road rage we're going to have. And over time, as more and more autonomous vehicles start operating, things will just get better and better and better. But initially, it could be quite a challenge. Absolutely.
And I think one of the other things, and Cam, I'm sure you've probably heard this argument before as well, that there's always been this talk of, well, you know, yes, the driverless cars might make the cities better. It will reduce the pollution and do all those other things that we've spoken about. But on the flip side to that, from the town planning perspective, is it then encouraging more sprawl, more development outside of our cities, and is that a good thing? But I think, you know, again, post-COVID, or during COVID and post-COVID, we have seen, particularly in Victoria where we live, a lot of people move to regional areas, and, you know, that work from home concept is certainly one that's very embedded in our society now. So we do have a lot of people in our workforces, I think, living and working regionally, which is great. So I think from that perspective, the idea of driverless cars would be excellent, but I think it's the people in between and whether or not it's encouraging a concept which is perhaps frowned upon in our society at the moment.
Yeah, and I'll take that one on, Jess. I mean, I guess the control of the urban boundary and sprawl is back to our planning brains as to what's appropriate, but taking into account this new technology might shape that thinking. I mean, if you retain a hard edge, then you might encourage people to move more regionally and help, if you like, consolidate the townships that are an hour and a half, even 2 hour drive away from Melbourne, because to get to work, you can work as you get to work. So it's a totally different proposition when you're in a vehicle that, as Cern said earlier, you can sleep, you can do work, you can have Zoom meetings, etc. So, you know, that's why we're having this conversation, I believe, because it needs to open the minds of our planners to think, how do we allow our cities to grow, or our, not just cities, but our regions to grow with the advent of this disruptive technology.
And obviously the challenge of our regional areas has always been economies of scale, right? Like getting big businesses to set up in regional areas so that those towns and cities can prosper. And so I think the opportunity that autonomous vehicles does bring in that regard is substantial, because it just means that workforce is far more likely to be living in those areas.
A few perspectives, I guess, I'd like to share on this topic. If you think about elevators and what those did to cities, elevators used to be human controlled, and then we automated the elevator. What did we get? We got massive skyscrapers. Are autonomous vehicles the elevators for streets? If you remove the human driver, it seems to me that we fundamentally changed what a city could be now, right? We don't have the constraint anymore that humans have to drive. So that's one thing for planners to think about, right? Another thing is this: the central business district, that exists because you want to have a core of people that are close to each other and can conduct business, right? But now if you've got autonomous vehicles that are super cheap and people can move around the city much easier, and as Cam said, they can work while they're doing this, do we move away from having a big central core to maybe little micro cores all around the city? Right. So I think it opens up creativity for what could a city be. And then if you think about autonomous vehicles, you don't need as much parking. We won't need as many vehicles. So it frees up all this area. In the US, we're notorious for parking lots everywhere. Many of our cities are ugly because there's so much parking. And a lot of the buildings actually are spaced quite far apart because of the parking lots that are required to be there, right? So again, it frees up a lot of creativity from planners in terms of how to create this more beautiful, perfect city, the spaces that people actually want to be in. And I think there's a lot of planners and architects and others that do a great job of that when given the opportunity. So I'm excited about that. I think that cities will really rise to this occasion at some point.
Yeah, I mean,
how much greener our cities would be if all of our parking lots were covered in green space and canopies.
Yeah. Cern, that paints a lovely vision of the future, and let's try and bring back to adoption and timelines to the best of your ability to I mean, it's probably one of the core things I wanted to sort of get from you is your thoughts on when should city planners expect this technology to meaningfully change how people move around cities? Are we talking now, 5 years, 15 years? And how could you give some confidence to whatever that time frame is in your mind that this time, the old famous, this time it's different, it's actually going to be this time?
Yeah. There's three components to this. One is the technology. Do we have the technology to create self-driving vehicles? The answer now is a resounding yes. It exists. The vehicles are already safer than a human. It's a matter of now of implementing that. The other factor has been cost. The cost of making an electric vehicle now is at the point where it's actually cheaper than making a regular gasoline-powered vehicle, internal combustion engine, and continuing to go down. Battery costs are declining and other parts of the vehicle are declining. So we've got the technology and we've solved the cost. Now it's a question in my mind of the regulatory environment. Ideally, you want to have a regulatory environment that works, one way in every country. You don't want each state or each city setting their own rules. Now, maybe there are some specific rules for certain areas that make sense, but just in general, ideally, we want a national sort of autonomy framework so that companies know if they roll out autonomous vehicle services that they're going to be treated fairly. Here are the operating expectations. Here are the operating standards. Here's the data that they need to share about safety. Here's the transparency that we expect from them in terms of operating safely, so that people can make an accurate evaluation of whether or not these vehicles are truly safe. That, in my mind, is the biggest hurdle at this point. I think the cost side and the tech side are largely solved. Not perfect, and that they'll be improving the technology for years to come. But I believe that, and particularly, I'm talking about Tesla specifically, that they have solved full self-driving enough that it is safer than a human today.
And Cern, from a regulatory perspective, has there been any beginnings, I guess, of that conversation in the US at this point? Like, where is the US at in that space?
There are many states that have passed their own laws that allow for autonomous operation. But I think increasingly we are understanding that a national level regulation makes the most sense, particularly when it comes to something like liability. What is the liability going to be for the autonomous vehicle provider in the event of an accident? Right. Those kinds of things I think need to be thought out. In the United States, accident injury attorneys, it's a massive, massive industry. And if those types of claims hit the autonomous vehicle providers, I'm not sure that they're going to survive that. Now, we want to hold companies accountable. There needs to be accountability. But just like airlines today, when there's a crash, there are some rules around how much airlines have to compensate people in the event of their death. And I think we need something similar probably in the autonomous vehicle industry.
So coming back to the timeline, Cern, when is this real for us? I mean, as I see it, there's taxis and Ubers as a first disruptive phase. Then I'd say the second disruptive phase is the second home vehicle, probably is the next to be knocked off. But when? When do you see this, city by city or broadly? Yeah.
In the United States, we're going to be rolling out city by city. Tesla, I'll talk about Tesla as an example, but there are other companies like Waymo and so on. But Tesla, for example, is already operating in two cities, Austin and the Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area. So we're going to see them roll out to more cities between now and the end of the year. Elon recently said 8 to 10 cities. We're going to see them expand the service area. And as you roll out into more cities and expand the service area, the cost per mile will come down. Initially, they're going to go after the ride-hail market, which is a fairly costly way to travel. It's like $2 to $4 per mile on average, sometimes more. And that is a $134 billion market. And then on this chart, it's showing you as you drop down the cost per mile, the market becomes larger and larger and larger. Eventually, you get to the point where the cost per mile is less than if the personally owned car that you own. Now, you're asking me about timelines. I'm not dodging the question. This is the question. We don't know exactly what the timeline is, but we can see Tesla already starting on the left side of this chart.
At
Elon has
$1 a
talked
mile.
about yeah, dollar a mile essentially, right? Which gets them into some pretty attractive, market opportunity. The problem is now they just don't have enough vehicles in operation in enough cities. But with some regulatory movement, with just starting, small services in the cities, I think things could pick up steam pretty fast. And there's no reason, again, to extend that to Australia. You now have supervised FSD. I'm not sure what the regulatory framework is for autonomous vehicles in Australia at this point, whether the national government has done anything or whether they're leaving it up to the states.
Yeah, the latter.
Okay. So that would be an impediment potentially.
Yeah.
Cam, I don't know
Yeah.
if you know, but has there been any progress on this on a state-by-state basis that you know about?
I don't think there's even progress at a state level. Well, I do know that. They've approved full self-driving supervised, and that is Australia-wide. So that is the first step in a national approval framework to allow it to occur. And that took a while.
What does that mean exactly? Maybe that's a question for Sam.
Tesla has this software, right, that allows the vehicle to operate autonomously. It's a vision-only system. It just operates with the cameras, bringing in the images. It processes those images on board on the FSD computer, and it tells the car how to drive. Essentially outputs steering angle and accelerator and braking. Per the rules, a human has to be behind the wheel to supervise the operation of the vehicle and be ready to take control at a second's notice, essentially. So the car is doing the work for you, but you are required to be there and be actively participating. Tesla's cars actually have a camera inside the cabin that looks at your eyes to see if you're actually looking at the road and not, for example, just sitting behind the wheel. It's actively looking at the road while you're going down the road.
And so, Cam, in terms of what we see in Victoria or Australia, that's the version of Tesla that we're seeing all around.
Yes. Whereas in the US, there's one addition past that with the Robotaxi, where they have what I refer to as a spotter in the front passenger seat. It's a bit like someone doing weights, and then someone's spotting them in case they fail. They can grab that bar and put it on. It's like a spotter. And so the car, there is no one sitting in the driver's seat. There is someone spotting. And this is a risk mitigating measure in the initial rollout for ultimately, and I think Elon said the other day at the earnings call that he anticipates in Austin, where they first launched this, the spotters to be in part removed. So that is a huge milestone if that happens.
Yes. And Tesla is rightly being very cautious about removing those spotters or those safety riders. Some call them safety drivers. They're not technically drivers because they're sitting in the passenger seat. And all they can essentially do is press a button that forces the car to stop or pull over safely. That's all they can do. So the cars ultimately are operating fully autonomously at all times. And I think it's just a matter of the company getting comfortable that in the areas where they operate, that the vehicles are behaving as they expect. Now, the good news is they're constantly iterating on their full self-driving software. We're all anxiously awaiting version 14 here in the US. Now, certainly those Robotaxis has probably been using that version of the software since the beginning. But we are all, as software, the beta testers, we're all anxiously awaiting to get to experience version 14 ourselves. And some people have it, and we're hearing some amazing things about how it's improved over version 13.
So we've spoken a little bit about the regulatory environment, and obviously that seems to be the biggest impediment, I think, broadly speaking, in terms of getting or seeing some of this technology being rolled out more widely. Are there other things that support the growth or which hold it back that we haven't spoken about?
Well, I think one thing that supports the growth is, again, the cost advantage. The economics of taking a human out of the vehicle are actually quite stunning, whether you're looking at Uber or taxi service. And so we can talk a little bit about that in detail if you'd like to. Also for automobile makers, instead of selling a car and let's say they make $5,000 on selling a car, if they instead sell it to themselves and put it in their own fleet, they could make, let's say, $25,000 to $30,000 a year for the life of that vehicle. So that vehicle could be, more than 10 times more profitable, could be 25 times more profitable than just selling a vehicle to somebody. So those kinds of economics could really drive the industry into this model, right? Now, so far, Tesla is really the only automaker that's really gone down this path, with the exception of a few Chinese companies that are trying to as well. But in the Western world, really just Tesla. Google has Waymo, but Google doesn't make their own cars. They're relying on their OEM partners. So the economics of it, I think, really make a difference. The other thing that I've noted is that, let's say Tesla is, for some reason, constrained by, they can't expand beyond Texas and California and maybe a couple other states. One of the strategies they could do is show everybody what could happen in a state like Texas if they flood the market with robotaxis and drive down the cost of transportation. The people of Texas would receive this economic benefit, right? It's a bit like now having, $5,000 a year of extra spending money because you're not spending that on transportation anymore. That would become a powerful pull for other states and a political force where people in those states say, we want the benefits that the people of Texas are enjoying. Bring this to our state. Look at how much safer. Look at how many less people are going to hospital and dying. Like, that kind of data is going to be available. We'll be able to see what the impact of autonomous vehicles truly are. And so eventually, I think this all solves itself. The question is, how long does it take?
Yeah. And what about in terms of infrastructure costs? I mean, surely there's got to be additional infrastructure that is required to be implemented to see this rollout occur. Is that right?
Yeah, I
And
think
who
so.
pays for
I
that?
would think of this. Yeah, good question. I think that initially it's not like we need new roads. So we're not talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about millions or perhaps hundreds of millions. So I think the curb becomes the most valuable real estate. We need effective pickup and drop off zones. If people don't need to park the car, they're going to ideally want to be dropped off right in front of their destination. So city planners need to start thinking about how to design the streets for that flow of pick up and drop off at the curb. Right. So that's going to be something I think really important. And in relation to that is then, how do you repurpose parking areas that we may not need as much of?
Yeah.
The problem is, in the early days of this, you're going to have still many more human-driven vehicles than autonomous. So, it's going to be a little messy in the start, but eventually I think cities will understand that they're going to be much more desirable and livable if they fully embrace this autonomous future, not to mention safer for everybody.
I think one fact that I'd just like to share is that there's about, in total, somewhere between 14 and 18,000, combination of taxis and Ubers running around Melbourne at any one time, any one day. So let's call it 15,000. It will not take a company like Tesla long to put 15,000 Robotaxis into the Melbourne market.
That's right.
I mean, that won't take long at all. And if they do that in accordance with this chart at $1 a kilometre, that's 3 times cheaper than what you pay today, and then heading down. So it will, there's this sort of, as you said, it's exponential. There's like a tipping point where it just, bang. It's not that hard to flood the market and replace taxis and Ubers with this system.
And it's amazing too. It causes a cascade of events, right? And we've already seen this in many countries, particularly Norway, which is on the leading edge of EV adoption. As EVs are adopted, you need fewer and fewer gas stations. So right now we have a gas station on every corner, or pretty much, right? So eventually, all that infrastructure needs to be repurposed. So the opportunities here for city planners are on multiple levels, multiple opportunities here to really change the way the city is structured. But you really have to think about sort of everything and what all the different implications are here.
Let's test the implications for public transport soon. How do you see that being impacted?
I think initially it complements, it doesn't cannibalize. I think that if you think about autonomous vehicles as excellent feeders, right? And sort of off-peak extenders to the public transport system. If you have a highly functional, well-run, inexpensive public transport system, that's fantastic. That's like the trunk. And what we're talking about here is the AVs kind of acting as the branches. And I think that's a weakness today of a lot of public transport systems is feeding those maybe less served, more remote areas, particularly at certain times of the day when there's, the frequency of buses just isn't there. If you're somebody that works late at night, catching a bus, you might have to wait an hour or something for a bus. That's not going to work, right? But ultimately, if the cost of autonomous vehicles gets so cheap, it could become cheaper than public transport. Now, I think there's an opportunity for cities to partner with the autonomous vehicle companies and have like one pass kind of system. You might catch an AV from one area to the train station, take the train, get off, and you have a car waiting to take you to the rest of your way. I think there's some symbiosis there that can happen, and I think that would be really exciting to see that.
Absolutely.
One of the criticisms that I often hear from planners and other people in our industry is that, for all of the good that comes from this technology, on the flip side of that, you do still have quite a significant environmental impact coming from these vehicles in terms of their lifespan being somewhat short. And correct me if I'm wrong, is it only sort of 10 to 15 years that you ordinarily get out of one of these vehicles as opposed to a traditional vehicle that you could probably have for many, many more years? And then, what is the impact at the end of that life cycle of the car? Is there a recycling facility? Like, how does that all work? And has there been advances in that space?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and I think this is also one that suffers from a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah.
If you think about the early days of EVs, they were not very efficient, didn't go very far, costly, use some materials that probably we shouldn't be using, like cobalt and things like that, right? The industry is maturing. The industry is finding ways to make them cheaper, be more responsible. Pretty much everything in an EV can be recycled, right? And so eventually it'll be more of a closed loop manufacturing system where we won't have to extract any resources anymore once we get to a certain steady state. So that's kind of exciting. But yes, in the early days, you have to mine these materials, right? And that's not great. But you have to remember what the end state is. We're getting ourselves to a better place, both in terms of lower cost, right? System that's healthier, right? We're not putting pollutants in the air like we do today. And also something that's going to save a lot of lives. If we add the autonomous part of this, it's not just this EV transition, but it's the autonomy part that is going to save people's lives. In the United States, the number of traffic fatalities is more than 40,000 per year. 40,000 people die every year on the roads of the United States. That's not even mentioning the people that are injured and need rehabilitation. Think about the economic cost of that. So that's exciting to me in terms of autonomous vehicles have the potential to drive that down to near zero ultimately. And I don't think human drivers could ever get to near zero. In fact, it's going the other way. We're all distracted. Everybody wants to be on their phones when they drive. So let them with autonomous vehicles. We have the technology. Let's let people do what they want to do, right? They want not to drive. Everybody's telling us they don't want to drive anymore.
That's my mindfulness time, Cern. When I drive, not using a phone. I love it.
Well, you don't have to use your phone in an autonomous vehicle either, Jess. You have a choice. You could take a nap if you like. Yeah.
I could do some meditation.
So there's some other products that Tesla are looking at that I think sort of completes the picture of autonomous vehicle advantages. There's the robo van, which is more like a bus solution, and then there's the robo truck, which is moving heavy goods, which is from a city planning perspective, the truck is a massive factor. Yep. Noise, safety. I just thought give you a chance to touch on those other emerging products that are less spoken about.
Yes.
And how they may complement the whole solution ultimately at some point in the future.
Yeah, this is where it gets really exciting. We shouldn't just limit ourselves to autonomous cars. So what we're talking about here is an autonomous world where anything that moves essentially becomes autonomous. This is Tesla's mock-up of what they call the robovan. I could eventually see these kinds of vehicles replacing buses. They'll be cheaper to operate. They'll be autonomous, right? And you can get more point-to-point locations than you could in a city bus, big city bus. So think about how, smooth operating a city street would be. Autonomous vehicles all behaving very politely. No one's honking. There's no noise. No one's screeching their tires or distracted on their phones. And so add into this mix, perhaps, autonomous trucking, which is necessary. We need trucks to move goods around. But with autonomous vehicles, you could perhaps do that at night and free up the city streets during the day for people. And then further, if we're talking about autonomous entities, then we also need to talk about humanoid robots or other kinds of autonomous robots. The autonomous trucks could deliver the packages, the materials, the goods to the stores and the locations during the night. Then the robots put them away in the stores on the shelves or whatever they need to do. Right? So that we can start making more use of 24 hours instead of just the times that humans are working and awake. Mm-hmm. Right. So again, from a city planning point of view, you've got to think about the complete rework of how things are going to be moved and distributed around the city. And of course, we can add drones into the mix as well. Autonomous drones. So it's, from the sky, from the ground. Also, Elon Musk happens to own a tunnel boring company called the Boring Company. And ultimately, we may have tunnels under the city streets. And so you could put the commercial vehicles, the trucks, and those kinds of things under the streets. Or you could put all vehicles, for that matter, under the streets and make cities just for humans to walk, right? Perhaps ride a bike, etc. That would be a beautiful thing long term.
Now, that's an interesting one. I did hear only a few months ago that the Boring Company has successfully started the first autonomous boring machine. You can just buy them and select A to B and off you go. There's no humanity involved. And, right. If you buy 100 of those, you've got 100 tunnels eventually. Much lower cost base than our current tunneling methodology. But I don't want to get too distracted in that.
But just to add to that, Cam, it turns a two-dimensional transportation network into a three-dimensional one. And I've got to imagine that's a city planner's dream. Right?
Yeah, and it just comes back to, I suppose, how are city planners responding? At the moment, it seems a bit of disbelief that this is so imminent. Cities are typically reactive, not proactive. And I guess what's the minimum preparation that a skeptical planner should be doing?
Well, I think first of all, it's recognizing this is coming, right? To essentially, not to offend anybody, but to get our heads out of the sand and recognize that this is coming. It's getting up to speed and familiarizing yourself enough with the technology and what's happening here. This is coming and it may come faster than you realize. So if that's the case, if you accept that, if you're willing to go there, then you need to start thinking about what the implications are and what your city should be doing. So you need an autonomous vehicle ready policy of some sort. How are you going to handle the drop-offs at the curbs? Right? Are there going to be certain zones? I mean, there's all these details that need to be thought through. Parking. If you are building facilities today and you're requiring certain minimum parking spaces, I think you need to start rethinking that. Because that infrastructure is going to need to change at some point because we won't need as much parking. These autonomous vehicles will just keep moving. There's no need to have them park on a busy street. Now, we might park them temporarily in other holding locations, but those can be, away from the downtown core or some other convenient location that's much quieter. We need to think about zones for cleaning and maintenance for these vehicles and how to make that efficient. So there's lots of different things, I think, to start thinking about. Who's in charge of that? I guess that remains to be seen, but we're going to have to go down that road eventually. And the sooner I think that people in each of these cities start to think about it, the better off they'll be and the more prepared they'll be when it happens. And potentially then the least number of problems will occur. because you don't want to end up with a situation where you're putting, if you think about these scooters that people could rent, right? And we've got city streets in some cities just littered with these scooters. To me, that wasn't a very well thought out implementation.
Mm.
And we don't want to have the equivalent of that for autonomous vehicles, where everybody's frustrated with these autonomous vehicles that are clogging the curbs and no one can move because you're waiting for pickup and drop off.
Mm.
And it's dangerous because people are getting into the vehicle on the wrong side or whatever it is, right? Like there's all these things that need to be thought through very carefully.
And that's where that
Yeah.
interim period, I think, between them arriving and the traditional cars being moved out will be really tricky, because I think there will be a lot of challenges, a lot of frustrations in that interim period.
Yeah.
From a government perspective, who have to fund trunk road infrastructure, do you see a material cost saving in terms of being able to defer some of those expansion requirements that, with the current mode of transport is a huge budgetary burden on governments, and hence a lot of city planners want to stop the sprawl because ultimately it's just adding more road infrastructure, costly. Is it true that through the autonomous vehicle we get more out of the existing infrastructure and we don't need to expand as much and can save some money at a government level?
I think ultimately that's the case, Cam. I worry a little bit in the near term because we're still going to have the expansion probably of the number of human-driven vehicles if cities are growing. And then autonomous vehicles are going to start creeping into that and are going to take sort of market share away from human-driven. Initially ride-hail, then taxi services, and then eventually, human-owned vehicles, privately owned vehicles. The question is then how long does it take before all that starts to play out, where very few people will decide that it's economical to own a vehicle. If the convenience of a robotaxi is there, if it's super cheap, then most people are going to make the economic decision. And I'm very confident about this. Once the unit economics are there, people are going to make the right choice and they're going to save that money. If you could save $5,000 or $10,000 a year, who wouldn't?
Yeah.
Right? To not have to drive, to be able to sit there and relax, eat, sleep, work,
And be safer.
and be safer. I mean, that is a slam dunk of a choice for any consumer.
Road networks, the analogy for me is a bit like the energy in the grid. The grid needs permanent power to handle the peaks. And then off peak, there's all this latent energy that's evaporating. Same with the road network. And so I do see when the scaling of this and the adoption hits a certain tipping point, I do see a spreading of the peak load. There won't need to be, businesses might be far more willing to spread the must be at work at 9 because you're working in the car on the way, and it just spreads that load.
That's right.
And yeah.
And also think about other things that go on in cities, right? Package delivery. Why do we do that during the day? Well, we do it during the day now because we need humans to do that work. But if that can be done autonomously overnight, then we say, okay, the policy of the city is all packages must be delivered between, midnight and 5 a.m.
And then that goes to, well, where do they drop that item and how you're planning for that?
That's right.
Like this pick-up drop-off zones.
That's right.
The other part, though, that we're doing a lot of the loading and unloading during the day because of noise concerns and noise issues. So again, if you're taking that away, you're not having that traffic noise and the trucks unloading and the beeping and what have you, then that's a much easier thing to be doing at night as well.
Potentially. You're right. There still could be some noise from some of that activity, but it would be a lot less than what it is today.
I think it also raises some really, and Cam, I'm sure you can attest to this as well, it raises some really interesting points around property value as well, particularly in Australia, and I'm sure the US is quite similar, that the areas in which we as town planners are typically encouraging growth and density to go is ordinarily on main roads, which is interesting when you consider some of the health implications that come from being in close proximity to huge amounts of air pollution. So removing that aspect from it or significantly reducing it through autonomous vehicles, what that does to property values along main roads, does that bring them back in line with the remainder of our developable area? It will be very interesting to see how that plays out.
I think that's a really good point, Jess. Just before I've got a slide on that, just before we do that, if you just go to the next slide here, I just want to point out one interesting impact of autonomous vehicles in cities. New York City, I think, generates something like 300 million, maybe more, in parking ticket revenue every year. It's a lost revenue for cities if they're not writing parking tickets. If you're not parking on the street anymore, right, and running the meter, and then you didn't feed the meter, there's no parking revenue anymore for a city like New York. Anyway, that's one minor point. But to the point about emissions, it's estimated that in the United States, it causes about 10,000 deaths annually from vehicle emissions. And so, I think you're right. If you can reduce emissions and make cities healthier and save these lives, it also improves real estate values in the areas that would currently affected by high emissions along major arteries. Absolutely. So again, this is information from ARK Invest, investment firm in the US. So this is not to be forgotten as well. Also, electric vehicles don't need as much braking as typical vehicles. Brake dust is also not a very healthy thing. So if you have vehicles that can move around and not use their brakes as much, that's also better for everybody. So there's all kinds of benefits.
Thank you. We're starting to get to the end of one. We typically try and keep these to an hour, Cern. So is there you've got a wonderful slide deck here. Is there anything in particular I think we've missed that you'd like to bring up?
Well, I think if we can just maybe go back to the second slide, the detail of the robotaxi implications. Let's just make sure that we review that. I think there's a few things perhaps we haven't talked about yet. Some things are obvious and maybe some things are less obvious. So I tried to break it down into what I call first, second, and third order effects. I don't think this is perfect, but I think it's one way to sort of think about this. First order effects, it's a new business model for the automakers. Instead of selling a car and making a little profit, they can put it in a fleet and earn recurring revenue. Tremendous. It undercuts rideshare, no doubt about it. Take the human out of the loop, you're going to undercut existing services. It also eventually will reduce vehicle ownership. And in the US, we talk about sort of the magic, 70 cents or something per mile. It's actually probably more than that. It's probably over $1 per mile before it would undercut vehicle ownership. But eventually, I think we'll probably get to something like 25 cents a mile. That savings is going to create economic stimulus for the rest of the economy, which is kind of exciting. It's going to increase the value of any vehicle that's autonomous capable. Tesla is producing its vehicles for years that have the computer and the cameras. They are all autonomous capable with a software update. Elon talks about awakening the system, awakening the robots. So they can go from, virtually no or very few autonomous vehicles to millions in theory overnight if they wanted to. It also decreases the value of any non-autonomous vehicle. If you own a vehicle that's not autonomous ready, once we have autonomous vehicles that are in existence and operating, the value of your vehicle in theory would go down because it's less useful now. Second order effects. As automakers start to make less and less autonomous ready vehicles, they get a diseconomy of scale. We always think about economies of scale as companies make more and more. It's going to work in reverse. As they make fewer and fewer, it's going to become more expensive, more costly. They're going to make less profit. They're going to have to shut down, lay off people, close plants, go bankrupt, etc. That's going to be a mess. If you do want to buy a car, the cost of status, I think, will become more expensive because that car is more valuable in an autonomous fleet than it is to sell to you. So if you want to own a car, fine. No one's going to stop you, but it may become much more expensive because that car can generate a lot of revenue as a service. So that's one thing to think about. We talked about saving lives, less pollution. It's going to take these internal combustion engines off the road. That's fantastic. It's going to destroy service station economics, which is great. I mean, not for the people that own the stations, but just in general. Reduces the need for parking, reduce parking revenue. We talked about that. Okay, third order. Real estate redevelopment opportunities. What are we going to do with all these extra parking lots? Residential parking garages that we may not need as much of. And this idea of more livable cities, which I think is a beautiful idea, and it's a tremendous opportunity for city planners. This is, a dream for a city planner to get the opportunity to remake their city. Incredible. What a great time to be a city planner. All right. It's also going to impact airlines and hotels. Some have theorized that because you could sleep in a robotaxi, why take a flight that's, let's say, an hour long when you can be in a car overnight and arrive after sleeping? And then you don't have to stay in a hotel along the way because you're sleeping in the car. The car is your hotel. So that's interesting too. We talked about reducing healthcare costs, impacts accident injury attorneys. We don't need as many of those folks, particularly if we get national legislation right. Right? We don't have an accident injury attorney for the airline industry, partly because there's not many injuries, but also partly because we've got a good framework. We're going to have faster, more efficient transportation, right? And the one thing too I want to mention here is that these cars are collecting data all the time that actually can be fed to the city. The city could actually instantly know when there's a pothole or some other problem in the roadway without hiring anybody. These cars could just instantly detect and report to the city that there's a problem on the street. And that's kind of amazing. They get real-time information. The data sharing that can happen here is quite exciting. It's also a little scary because they could actually track everybody in the city. There's some downsides to data sharing. Productivity booster, you can do whatever you want in the car. You can work, you can sleep, you can play. Fantastic. And then the most exciting thing for me as a financial guy is it becomes a platform. It's not just about moving humans around more efficiently, but it's a platform for other services. We talked about one of them, and that's delivery of packages and food and other things. It also becomes an advertising platform. You're in the car. Do you want to pay today, or do you want a free ride and be subject to advertising? That may be a choice. You go to a new city. Do you want the car to give you a curated experience? The car to be your tour guide? The car could talk to you, right? It's an AI-powered car. You could talk to the car. It can be your tour guide and tell you what you're seeing in the city. Or it could take you on a restaurant tour, or whatever it is that you can dream of. It could customize that experience for you. And that revenue opportunity for the autonomous vehicle operator. Those are just a few of the things I think that we're looking at in terms of the changes that are coming. And I'm sure I've missed dozens.
That's fantastic, Cern.
Well, very, very interesting. I was watching a movie the other day, and I can't even remember what it was called now, but basically at the end of it, all of the Teslas were hacked and they were driven off a cliff. So I know this is always one of the concerns that people have around, particularly that data sharing side of things and, our lives being controlled by computers. I'm sure you've come across that question before.
Yeah, I mean, our lives are already controlled by computers, whether we like it or not. My bank account the money in my account is not real. It's just the numbers in a computer. So if you're worried about Tesla being hacked, then you should worry about your bank account, your medical records, your emails, right? All the files in your computer, everything, right? So it's not just unique to vehicles. It's everything in our lives are digitized and increasingly so. There are ways of protecting that, and it's just incumbent upon companies to ensure that they're doing the right things there.
Very good. Good answer. Well, thank you, Cern. I think we've come to the end of pretty much all of our questions, unless there was any last comments that you had or any other slides that you wanted to quickly touch on. Thank you for the incredible discussion. I think it's been really interesting and has highlighted to me far more concern around our industry not being ready for this sort of technology. As I said before, I think we've had so many discussions about it over the years, and I certainly haven't been kept up to date with where the technology is currently sitting. So it's been a really big eye-opener for me personally. Cam, did you have any last thoughts that you wanted to share before we finish up?
No, nothing to add. I think Cern's done a great job covering the topic today.
The only two things I would add is I think from a city planner's perspective, I think the curb is becoming the most valuable real estate. And it's worth thinking about how to manage that and optimize that. And then from just individual listeners, if you do get a chance, if you're in the United States and you're in Austin, Texas, or if you're in the Bay Area in San Francisco, go check out Tesla's Robotaxi. Experience for yourself what it's like to ride in a driverless vehicle. Now, you can also ride Waymos in other U.S. cities, and that's also a great experience. And there's some other autonomous vehicle providers as well. So I just encourage anybody, if you are in the US, please experience that. It will blow your mind.
Good recommendation. All right. Well, thank you so
And
much.
hopefully coming to Brisbane and Melbourne and the rest of Australia soon as well.
Are we doing Culture Corner, Jess?
Oh, we can absolutely do Culture Corner. Cern, something that you might have seen, watched, listened to, or experienced recently that our listeners might enjoy, and it doesn't have to be in relation to autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a one-track mind on some of this stuff. I'm so focused on the changes that are coming. And it is not just limited to autonomous vehicles. And we talked a little bit about robots, but let me really quickly paint a bigger picture of what's happening. We are moving from one economic system to another. We are moving to an AI-powered, robot-driven world. Anything that moves is going to be AI-powered. Literally everything. It just makes sense. We need humans out of the loop on everything that moves. It'll be safer, better for everybody. But on top of all that, with the changes that we're seeing in our economy, we're going to be driving down the cost of transportation towards zero over time. AI is going to drive down the cost of intelligence towards zero. And with robots, the cost of labor towards zero. And with those inputs, we're going to drive down the cost of food, the cost of living lower and lower and lower. We are about to be hit by the most deflationary force that we've ever seen in the history of Earth. And if people aren't thinking about autonomous vehicles, they're certainly not thinking about the implications of what I just said there. Now, for more on that, I would encourage you to look up Tony Seba's work. If you just look on YouTube and put Tony Seba. I interviewed him a few months ago about his new book called Stellar. And it's basically what Elon Musk was also talking about and taking us to a world of sustainable abundance and what that looks like. That is something I think, too, that extend your thoughts even further from this autonomous vehicle world.
Wonderful.
Sorry, I'm not sure how much culture was in that, but that's, I think, an important thing to think about.
Cam, what about you?
Well, at the risk of being controversial, I was reading about the Jason Bourne phone. Now, I'm not sure if you understand the concept, but the phone is a tracking device, and our privacy is constantly eroded. Now, without being a conspiracy theorist, you can buy a Jason Bourne phone that means that you will retain some privacy. And I think in an era of digital ID that we seem to be heading towards, I'll be getting myself a Jason Bourne phone.
Is that just like a Nokia?
No. You can still do all the apps. It just has hardware. It's an open source hardware infrastructure that sits behind it that means that you just can't be tracked.
Okay. That sounds
well, you may think you can't be tracked, but these autonomous vehicles can track you around the city.
Well, this is true. Might not. I can't. May be digitally invisible, but not physically.
Right. That's right.
Well, mine is, and I mentioned this probably 12 months or so ago on the podcast, I've taken up Duolingo again and am relearning Italian. And the funny thing about it is, this conversation about tracking, I stopped doing it probably 6 months or so ago. And I'm just being harassed on a daily basis by that annoying little bird saying, come on, you haven't done your practice. Come on, I'm feeling sad. Where are you? So it's working because I've taken it back up again.
Lovely, Jess.
Just wait until there's a physical robot in your living space that bothers you in the same way.
Tapping me on the shoulder.
Yep.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Cern. That's been such an enriching discussion and will be of real interest, I think, to a lot of our listeners. So I'll be really intrigued to see what the feedback is, particularly from our industry. And we look forward to hopefully hosting you one day in Melbourne if you ever get out this way.
I would welcome that opportunity, and thanks for having me on. And I'm honored to be the first guest on your first video show. That's really exciting. So I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cern.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jess.